What separates America from the rest of the world? In fact, what separates Western civilization from all other civilizations? Why does it seem like America has gotten so far ahead of the rest of the world? Well, one person who addresses that is Lawrence Mead. He is the author of a new book called The Buredens of Freedom, Cultural Difference and American Power. And I'm really looking forward to this interview. And Lawrence, welcome to the show.
My pleasure.
All right. So before we get into the details of the book, I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about your background and about yourself and why you decided to write this book.
Okay. A long time ago when I was in graduate school, I had interests in what's called political development, namely how countries evolve their governments, and especially what would happen to the new colonies coming out of European empires and becoming independent nations. This was in the 60s and 70s. And it was commonly thought at that time that they would become more or less like the West. They would have very similar regimes. They would be democratic. They would be based on rule of law and so on. And in fact, that didn't happen. Most of those countries are rather poorly governed today. They're rather chaotic. The regimes are weak. They're not really democratic. They don't really have the rule of law. So government quality has gone downhill since independence. That was a puzzle. Nobody really had an explanation for that. And then later on, I went to Washington and became an expert on poverty and welfare reform, and I wrote a number of books about that. And there, the mystery was why people could remain poor for a long time in America, even though it's a rich country when jobs are available. And many experts went looking for various social barriers that might explain that, like lack of jobs or racial discrimination and many other things. And they didn't really succeed. We didn't really have a good explanation for why people remain poor. And the third issue that's come up recently is immigration. Immigration today is much less successful, really, than it was 100 years ago when most of the immigrants were coming in from Europe. Now they're coming mostly from Asia and Latin America, and the assimilation is much worse. We're really having a much harder time absorbing immigrants and having them adjust to American culture. So there's something different about that as well. And in the current book, what I basically say is that all these problems are attributable to cultural difference. The reason why poor countries and also poor people in America and also many immigrants are having difficulties is that they're coming from the non-Western world. They're coming from a different tradition from Europe. Americans are the descendants of Europe and especially of the British. We got our institutions from them. Our culture is individualistic. It turns out that gives us a much better basis for all the things that have gone wrong in much of the rest of the world. And in the new book, what I try to do is explain how that happens, what is special about Western culture versus the non-West that allows it to be more successful in these ways. It doesn't mean that Western culture is superior in general. In fact, there are many virtues in the non-West. But we have a great advantage in developing our strength and power in America relative to the rest of the world, primarily because we are a Western country. And how that happens is the main point of the book.
All right, I'm speaking with Lawrence Mead, and the book we are talking about is called Buredens of Freedom, Cultural Difference and American Power. By the way, I also wanted to note that you are a professor of politics and public policy at New York University, and of course have written several books, other books as well. You just talked about you wrote books on welfare reform, is that right?
Yeah, yes. I wrote the theory behind welfare reform, basically. These books argued that the best solution to welfare was to require the recipients to work. The adults who are drawing benefits should also be required to work in return for those benefits. And that was more or less the policy we adopted in the 90s, and it was quite successful. It caused most of those who were drawing aid to leave and get jobs, and that's what the public wanted, and that was a big step forward. It wasn't a complete solution to the poverty problem, but it was a big step. And what I'm doing in the new book really is explaining why it was so successful. There were reasons in the background why that policy turned out to be the best way to go forward.
Yeah, the central theme in your book is cultural differences, mainly between not just America, but Western civilization versus all other civilizations. You make the point that American and Western civilization is very individualist, while other civilizations are not. Explain that a little more.
Sure. An individualist culture is one where people begin with their own goals and values, and they seek to realize these out in the world, to have some impact on the world, to change it to be more according to their own ideas of the way things should be. That's characteristic of the West, and really only the West. In the non-West, what we find is a more cautious, what the research calls a more collective culture. By collective, they don't necessarily mean big government. They mean it's a culture in which people don't think of themselves as individuals, but rather as parts of groups. And the groups are oriented to adjusting to outside pressures and demands rather than trying to change the world. So the West is unique in that people are individualists, and they assert themselves against the environment and try to change things. And it's because of that that Western civilization, beginning in Europe, always had a very dynamic quality. There was constant change and improvement. Europe never stands still. Starting in the Middle Ages, it becomes richer and richer and then more and more powerful and eventually ends up running the world. And the rest of the world was very different. The rest of the world has many attractions. It has sophisticated cultures, but they're not individualist. They're cultures where people defer to authority and they wait to be told what to do. So those cultures tend to be static, tend not to change much over time, whereas the West is always moving forward, always changing and improving. And it's that culture which was developed most fully by the British, and then the British founded America. So America today has the strongest Western culture of any part of the West, really. And that is a principal reason why the U.S. became rich and powerful and ends up leading the world. So the reason for American primacy is really cultural. And that is different from the rest of the world. Now, very recently, several Asian countries, currently China, have found ways to become richer and more powerful by using a more collective culture. What they do is rely upon authority. They essentially, the leaders decide what to do, and they direct the society to move in a certain direction. And in that way, they've been able to make considerable progress. But it's very different from the West. It's not based on broad-based initiative. It's based on conformity to the will of the rulers. And that has gotten them a considerable distance. And therefore, the contest for world leadership today between China and America is really a contest of cultures between two different ways of life.
Now, one important point that you make in the book, which I understand, but a lot of people seem to misunderstand, is that there is a difference between culture and race. And unfortunately, when you bring up differences in cultures, people take it as you're racist, even though that's not what you're saying. Talk about that distinction.
Yeah. The fear that the talk of culture is really racist is the principal reason why talk of culture has really been proscribed. We really have not allowed there to be discussion of cultural differences within America or in the world. And that's very strongly supported by the establishment and the media and the government and, above all, the academic world. That's why this book was very hard to publish. I found it very difficult to find a publisher that was willing to take on an argument that could be construed by some as racist. But I do want to emphasize that my sources, which are the literature about world cultural differences, these authors say very firmly this is not a racial idea. Culture really means culture and nothing more than that. It's ways of life, and the ways of life are not rigidly determined by race. Quite the contrary. Culture is dependent on how you're brought up, basically on culture, on the attitudes of the society that you are in, and that isn't determined by race. And in fact, culture can change and is changing. In America today, we have some parts of the population are becoming more individualist. That is particularly true of the black middle class. They're really my heroes. Blacks come initially from Africa, a very non-individualist, very collective-minded part of the world. But they've been in America long enough so that part of that group, I would estimate about a third of it, has become individualist. They're now pursuing their personal goals and values like other people, and they're doing just fine. So racism isn't really a good way to explain their situation. And conversely, there are some elements of the white population that descend from Europe who are giving up on individualism. The less educated working class is dropping out of employment, engaging in getting involved in many more social problems than they used to do. It's a serious problem for us. We have to somehow persuade that group to return to employment, return to bearing what I call the burdens of freedom. In other words, to live an individualist life. So there's cultural change in both directions, and it's really not related to race.
It's very interesting. Yeah, your title of your book is "Burdens of Freedom." Discuss why you gave that the title, and what's the difference between burdens of freedom versus what other civilizations do.
Yeah. Burdens of Freedom is designed to capture the great fact that a free society isn't carefree. It doesn't mean that we don't have demands that we face. A free country is actually quite demanding, quite difficult. In fact, that has to be the case. I mean, America wouldn't be as rich and powerful as it is if we were easygoing. This is not an easygoing country. Most people work hard, they pursue their goals, and the obligations they face come from a number of different places. They come from the government, and government, although we criticize government, it's also very strong in America. We have to obey the laws. We have to pay taxes. Government's serious about that. That isn't true in most other countries. So the government makes demands on us. Other people make demands. But above all, the demands come from the goals that we ourselves have set, the things that we're trying to achieve. Those are the heaviest demands. And another great demand is competition. In a free society, people get to compete over things that are desirable, like having a good job and living in the suburbs in a nice house and getting ahead and all those things. A lot of people want that, and so there's competition. So America is easily the world's most competitive country, and that's hard for people coming from non-Western countries. They, for their part, bear what I call the burdens of necessity. That is, they orient to outside demands, not the inner demands of their own lives, but rather demands made on them by social convention, by government, by their own families. So those societies, the constraints on them are coming from the outside world mostly, and they defer to those outside pressures. Whereas in the Western world, most people are burdened most of all by their own responsibilities, the thing that they have taken on to pursue their own goals. So that's why everyone is burdened in some way, but we're burdened in very different ways. In the West, the fact that we have all these inner obligations is the way we can become free in the outside world. So our outward freedom depends crucially on bearing the inner obligations of freedom. And in the non-West...
And this is a really interesting topic. I want you to hold that thought for just a moment. But I'm talking with Lawrence Mead, who is author of Burdens of Freedom, Cultural Difference in American Power. If you want to find this book, you can find it at Amazon.com or anywhere books are available. More on this topic. I'm Michael Yaffee. Burdens of Freedom. In Western civilization, we have what our guest calls the burdens of freedom on the individual, but in the rest of civilization, he has what they call the burdens of necessity. That's right. I am speaking with Lawrence Mead, who is the author of the new book, Burdens of Freedom, Cultural Difference in American Power. And Larry, in the last segment, you were discussing how burdens of freedom puts different expectations on the individual in Western civilization, especially America, rather than the burdens of necessity, which is completely different expectations on the individual in the rest of the world.
Yes. In the Western world, burdens of freedom primarily mean the responsibilities that we take on to pursue our own goals. So the people who are moving ahead in America really are not free in the sense of carefree. Rather, they have to satisfy all the expectations that they've placed on themselves, and to some extent other people also place on them. So their lives are actually dominated by obligation. They're not free in the sense of carefree. And in addition, the Western culture has a strong moralistic streak where people have abstract general ideas of right and wrong, and they generally feel obligated to fulfill those mandates in dealing with various kinds of issues and also in critiquing government. So for all these reasons, they're really not carefree. Now, in the non-West, you have a situation where most of the pressure that you have to adjust to is coming from the outside world. It's coming from convention, from social pressures, from government, but people don't have as many inner goals. So what they primarily orient to is conforming to the outside pressures. And also the moral structure is more conformist. What right and wrong means in those societies mostly has to do with the context. What's right and wrong is what other people expect you to do, pretty much, and it's not based on inner abstract conceptions of the sort that we have in the West. So for these reasons, the pressures are mostly outer, not inner, and life proceeds from the outside in, whereas in the West it proceeds from the inside out. I think that's the main contrast.
Yeah, and in the book, you mentioned that one of the big reasons why we have more of an individualist culture, the burdens of freedoms here, versus a more collectivist burdens of necessity culture in the rest of the world, has to do with religious differences, in that their religion kind of puts different expectations on them.
Yes. The Western religion comes from the Bible. It's the creation, really, of Judaism and later Christianity. In those traditions, there are strong notions of right and wrong, but also the individual is trusted. God looks to the individual to carry out his purposes in the world, and individuals have to figure out what that means, and they are allowed to pursue their own purposes. And so the tendency of Western religion is very strongly in the direction of individualism. In the non-West, the main religious traditions are much more conformist. They tend to support the existing state of affairs, the status quo. You don't find the same tendency to criticize the world in terms of moral absolutes. Instead, what you find is conformity, acceptance, in fact, to a certain extent, withdrawal from the world. So the non-Western religions, often very sophisticated, very venerable. Nonetheless, they don't produce change in the way that Western religion does. The Western traditions are much more energetic and activist. People take on board a series of moral goals, and they try to go out and change the world to correspond. So that's consistent with Western culture, and religion becomes a major source of that attitude.
Now, I know you kind of mentioned this in the book, but talk about some of the countries that are really apart, more individualists, and some of the countries that are not individualists. Just give some specific examples of each.
Well, the Western tradition is strongest in Western Europe. That's where it arose. And then especially in Britain and the Netherlands, you find the most strongly developed individualist cultures. And then those countries, particularly the British, end up founding the United States. So America becomes an expression of really the strongest individualist culture the world has ever seen. The most important group in forming American culture is actually the Puritans, those who came initially to America in the 17th century and set up a culture which is strongly individualist, very moralistic, committed both to democracy and also to strong government. And those combinations, and that's the reason why we have a culture in which there's strong emphasis on individual rights, but at the same time, government is also very powerful, is able to carry out ambitious public purposes. So this is where the Western tradition comes from and finds its eventual culmination, really, in the United States. The countries that we're dealing with now as rivals, particularly in Asia, coming from very different tradition. They come from a background where the individual is subordinated to the group, and those countries can be quite powerful as long as the leaders set a direction. Here, the most dramatic example is Japan. Japan is a country that is actually quite well ruled by non-Western standards and has a history of power, a history of imperialism, really. The Japanese created a big empire in Asia in the early 20th century. Unfortunately for them, they got involved in a war with the United States, and we conquered Japan pretty easily and proceeded to reform the country and make it more democratic. But Japan was already a democratic country before that. So Japan is an impressive case of a non-Western country that is nonetheless well-governed. China is a lot less well-governed, but it's a very big country, and those leaders, too, are setting a direction, and the society is getting much richer and more powerful. But they don't have the American tradition of pursuing abstract goals. They're not trying to save the world. They're actually quite cautious. So I would say Japan is historically more ambitious. China is really not ambitious, and I don't expect they're going to try to run the world. That isn't really their tradition. They're more conformist. Asia is much the same. In some ways, the most interesting case is Islam. The Arab countries have an Islamic tradition which begins with an enormous conquering energy. Islam conquered the Middle East, North Africa.
And uniting as well, as it was a very divided area before Islam.
Yeah, yes. So Islam looks very aggressive, but then it lost its energy, and it became a more conventionally non-Western country dominated by external authority, by top-down rulers who decide what to do, and a rather weak government. So Islam today is a considerable problem for other societies because it isn't well governed, and it's very frustrated. There's a lot of energy in the Middle East that isn't going anywhere and doesn't really lead to any positive result. There have been rebellions against Islamic governments. That's what we saw at the time of the Arab Spring. But they don't go anywhere. They don't produce good government because government that's effective has to have a civic basis. It has to have a basis of civic values. And the West has been able to generate a civic culture because of the moralism of the culture, which has these abstract general ideas of right and wrong. So Americans have an idea of what good government is, and they basically insist on it. And when government misbehaves, there are consequences, and there's some kind of sanction. And we put people in jail who are corrupt, and we investigate the Trump administration, as we've been seeing recently. Those events occur because the public is impatient about good government. But in the non-Western world, they really don't have that attitude. We don't have a civic basis, and therefore the governments are much weaker. They're more corrupt, less effective. And Islam shows that. Islam is really a tremendous falling off from what it was centuries ago.
And where does Latin America fall in this spectrum?
Yeah. Latin America is mostly a former colonial region run by Spain, which is a Western country, but the population in most of Latin America is actually Native American. These are peoples who were there before the Europeans arrived. They have a traditional non-Western culture. It's conformist. It's not individualist. And those countries have a sort of superficial institutions and cultures derived from Spain. You have the Roman Catholic Church. You have what looks like modern government, but those governments are actually quite passive, and they don't have the kind of dynamism you find in the West because the underlying society isn't Western. It's really a Native American society, which is static, which goes on more or less as it has for generations, and doesn't inherently change because the reflexes are to conform to the existing state of affairs. So Latin America is complicated. It does have some Western aspects, and there's some countries like Argentina and Chile where there was enough immigration from Europe, so those countries have cultures that are to some extent Western, but not to the point where they can become the kind of power that you find in the Western world, and especially in America.
And it seems like a lot of the focus now, at least when it comes to American policy, is Mexico, because it's right to the south of us.
Yes. What's happening in Mexico and also Central America is really problems of order. Much of Mexico is governed by drug gangs. These gangs dominate the Central American countries, and that's caused many people to flee and try to come to America. So they're trying to get away from the disorder of their own countries, and that
right. And again, immigration, immigration is a really important topic. And I'll have to ask you a lot of different questions on that in just a moment. I'm speaking with Lawrence M. Mead. He is the author of the new book, Buredens of Freedom. He's also a professor of politics and public policy at New York University. His book, Buredens of Freedom, Cultural Difference and American Power, is available at Amazon and other fine bookstores. Really interesting book that talks about the difference between Western civilization, the culture in Western civilization, and other culture and how that affects us today. I'm speaking with Lawrence Mead, who's the author of the new book, Buredens of Freedom, Cultural Difference and American Power. We've been discussing how the culture of America especially, but Western civilization as a whole, that culture is more individualist, where other cultures, especially in Asia, but also somewhat true in Latin America, is more collective, is more we bear the burdens of freedom, while they bear the burdens of necessity, and it has its roots in past government and also religion and culture. And Lawrence, one issue that always comes up when you're talking about the difference between countries is the issue of immigration. In America, there's a lot of immigrants, legally and illegally, coming from Latin America, Mexico, and the Central American countries. Talk about how that's different than the immigration we saw in the early 20th century that came mostly from Europe.
The earlier immigration of, say, a century ago was heavily from Europe. It was mostly from Eastern Europe, but it was still within the European tradition where most of the people who came here I'm thinking of the Irish, the Italians, were actually individualists in their basic view of the world. Maybe not so strongly as the Western Europeans, like the British and the Dutch, but still within that tradition. So when they came to America, they had an easier time assimilating than later immigrants because they were coming from Europe, because America was essentially a European country. Today, however, the immigrants are coming mostly from Latin America and Asia, where the traditions are not individualist. And that has meant that these people face much more assimilation problems in the United States, because it isn't just enough to learn English or the details of American life. You also have to take on an individualist personality. You have to be willing to see life as a project where you set your own goals and set out to achieve them. That's not something you have to do in the non-Western world for most people. And the demand to do that and the expectation that you're going to try to get ahead and you're going to compete with other people to do that and get through school and all that, these demands are quite severe, and they're not something for which people are prepared when they immigrate. So especially Hispanics who've come from Mexico are having quite a difficult time. This group has great difficulty getting through school. Although the initial immigrants work hard and they usually obey the law and so on and so on, their children often do not. They don't get through school. They have problems with various social problems. Also, the families are much weaker after they come to America than before. We have rising female headedness among Hispanics. And that's all due to the fact that they're facing new demands, which they didn't face in Mexico or Central America. Asians are often thought to have been more successful because they do much better in school, and that's true. However, after school, Asians have a problem getting ahead in their careers because they're not very individualist. They basically are good at following orders. They do what other people tell them to do, but they're not very good at setting their own direction and asking new questions rather than just answering the questions. So Asians have a problem, too, with being individualist. And that's why those cultures, they're adding something to our own culture, and that's a good thing, but they have to adjust to being individualists if they're going to be fully American.
Now, some activists will argue that the real reason why, say, Hispanic groups from Central America or Mexico are not succeeding or getting as ahead as they should is because of things like institutional racism, that businesses and institutions in this country are really racist towards Hispanics. What do you think about that?
Well, that's an argument that is made, but the problem with that is it assumes that people would react adversely to a group simply because of skin color. Now, that, to me, doesn't make a lot of sense, and we have a lot of research showing that the mainstream public, the non-minority public, has given up racism some time ago, really. This is not now a prevalent attitude. I don't mean there are no racists in America. There certainly are. But that isn't the main reason why these groups encounter distrust. It's rather that they're not behaving in an individualist manner, which the rest of America takes as normal. It's harder, particularly for Hispanics and Asians, to hold themselves personally responsible for anything, because to do that means to make commitments of an inner kind, to say, I'm going to do a certain thing. And that is not something that's part of their original culture, because for them, the obligations are collective. They have to do with what the family wants, what the people around you want. You don't really have individual responsibility in the non-West. That's very much a Western idea. And because these groups can't communicate that, they don't think of life that way, they become distrusted by the rest of the society, which does think of life that way. And that is, I think, the real basis for distrust among these groups. It isn't racism in the old sense. I think that's well in the past now. It's rather that cultural difference makes it harder for people to cooperate because they don't see life in the same terms. And that's what has to happen. That's what has to change for there to be assimilation. It's necessary that the new groups become individualists themselves. And the best example here is the black middle class. Blacks begin as a non-Western group because they came from Africa. They went through slavery and Jim Crow. But today, about a third of the group, I would estimate, is now middle class, and they pursue goals like other people. And they are simply not bothered by distrust in the same way, because they've taken on the mainstream culture. They've become individualists. So that is the real solution here. It isn't our problem. It really isn't racism in the old sense. It's cultural difference, and we need to address that.
And speaking of addressing it, in the book, you actually have some ideas for immigration reform that you're proposing.
Yeah. The main thing is to reduce the numbers. Right now, we have well over 1 million people coming in from Latin America every year. That's too many. We can't assimilate that. We need to take steps to reduce the inflow. I would eliminate the illegal aliens, which we can do rather easily. And I would also reduce family reunification. I would put an end to birthright citizenship and the asylum system. These are all ways in which people manage to enter the country illegally. And that means that the inflow is too great. The problem isn't fundamentally that it's illegal. It's rather that we have too many people coming in. We really have to have a fewer number come in so that we can then devote more time and attention to assimilation, and especially in the schools. We need to devote more effort for the schools, especially for Hispanic students, to get them to see school as positive. Right now, Hispanics have a really hard time getting through school, and it's mostly because they're not ready for competition. They don't see school as a positive place where they can get ahead. They're very afraid of it, and the same with their families. So they need to get over that. We need to be helpful to them. At the same time, we need to set definite standards. And we are doing that. In the best schools, we are, in fact, successful in moving Hispanic students forward. So we need to expand schools that can do that. That's probably the most important single step.
And we have less than a minute here, but I did want to ask you, what do you think of America's future? Do you think we keep our individualist culture and continue to prosper or not?
Well, that's the great question. There are groups in the country that never were very individualist, and others like the low-skilled working class that are moving away from individualism. That's the main threat to our leadership, I think. We need to reaffirm an individualist culture within America. And when we do that, we'll be able to continue leading in the outside world because we don't really have competition out there. I don't think China is trying to take over the world. China is likely to dominate East Asia, but they're not going to be the world leader that the United States has been. The cultural basis of America gives it a much stronger position for leading other countries. Because we have the moralistic culture that gives us these abstract goals, we therefore are more trusted by other countries than Asia. And we're going to go on leading the world. I think we're going to bear burdens in doing that. I don't think it's going to be easy, but there's no alternative. The United States really has to be the world's leader.
Lawrence M. Mead, author of Buredens of Freedom, Cultural Difference and American Power, available at Amazon and other bookstores. Really fascinating book, great interview. I really appreciate you coming on the show with me today.
My pleasure.